We are glad to be here. I'm honored to be asked to moderate this conversation. I know both of these folks well and held them both in very, very high regard. And we're dealing with a sensitive subject. A little over a year and a half ago, I had the privilege of going to Jerusalem with the president of the Rhode Island Board of Rabbis and the president of the Rhode Island Council for Muslim Advancement. And so the three of us went together to be at a conference there. And I had been once to Israel once before, and every time I go, I come back feeling not quite as smart as I was when I first went. Because these are complicated matters, and people's lives are at stake in the midst of all of our conversation. Our format tonight is going to be fairly informal. Jim is going to share some information. Martha is then going to share some information. The two of them will talk back and forth for just a little bit, and then we want to open it up to comments and conversation. If I can just reiterate, our expectation is that we will all listen to each other, and that when we have a point to make, obviously we want people to feel free to make their point, but let's do it in a way that is kind and thoughtful and civil, and that will give us a good opportunity to leave here perhaps a little better informed than when we first came in. So, Rabbi, would you like to begin, please?
Sure. I want to emphasize the word conversation. This is not a debate. We have I suspect, looking around, that people hold very different views. The really important thing is to try to listen to each other and hear competing and very different narratives. In thinking about what I could do to succinctly set forth my own point of view, I thought I would read a column that appeared in the Jewish Voice. I write a bi-weekly column for the Jewish Voice, and I've been doing that for 8 years now. Excuse me, for 6 years. Don't overdo it. It's been 18 years I've been writing a column for the Barrington Times. The column came out on August 1st, but it's reflecting what was going on around July 15th, because I had to get it into the editor. Unfortunately, not much has changed, except the numbers are worse. So I'm going to read you this and maybe make a couple of comments to bring it a little bit up to date. But this is what readers of my column read on August 1st, or whenever they got around to reading it, if they did. My column, by the way, is called "It Seems to Me," and that's very important. It seems to me, but that doesn't mean it's true, and it doesn't even mean that it's going to seem to me when I read it back 6 months from now or a year from now. So I'm pretty fluid, and I don't have the answers to. I only write about things for which I have no answers. Otherwise, it wouldn't be any fun. It wouldn't be honest. So this is a first attempt to deal with a very, very painful situation, and my column is entitled "What Happens to a Dream Deferred." This has been a sobering summer for all of us who care deeply about Israel, and have been hoping for some progress towards Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation within the framework of a two-state solution to the decades-long conflict. The kidnapping and murder of 3 Israeli teenagers, Naftali Frankel, Gilad Sha'ar, Eyal Yifrach. The revenge kidnapping and murder of a Palestinian teenager, Muhammad Hussein Abu Khader. An explosion of hatred and racist violence between Arab and Jew. A rain of Hamas rockets on Israel. a rain of Israeli bombs and artillery shells on Gaza. Israeli troops searching for rocket launchers amidst the twisting tunnels and byways of Gaza. Collateral damage, the deaths of several hundred civilian men, women, and children, and you all know that that number has risen to over 2,000. Many of us in the Jewish community of Greater Rhode Island have friends and relatives in Israel, and we are viscerally worried. We know that if but a single Hamas rocket eludes the Iron Dome missile defense system and hits its mark, the results could be catastrophic. Speaking personally, my niece through marriage and her 11-year-old triplets on a family visit to Israel spent the night of July 9th in a bomb shelter in Beersheba. Afterwards, they moved in with other family members in Beit Shemesh, where the three kids had to keep themselves within very close proximity to the miklat, the bomb shelter, in their new home away from home. At this point in the evolving crisis, I consider it counterproductive to ask who is to blame. I would argue that there is more than enough blame to go around. Right now, as I type these words, and this is back around July 15th, this is the question we need to be asking. How can we turn back from the abyss of violence and destruction? Let us begin by ratcheting down the rhetoric, the howls of hatred, the threats and the counter-threats. In the long run, a continuing escalation of hostilities means that everybody will be losers. Ironically, the sanest voices in the recent outburst of violence have come from the bereaved families of the murdered teenagers. Yishai Frankel, uncle of Naftali, one of the Israeli kidnap victims, spoke on the phone with Hussein Abu Khader, the father of the murdered Muhammad. The two men, Arab and Jew, crossed the ethnic divide to bring comfort to each other. As Naftali's uncle told the press, the life of an Arab is equally precious to that of a Jew. Blood is blood. Murder is murder, whether that murder is Jewish or Arab. In a similar gesture of human solidarity, in this time of profound suffering, Rabbi Rafi Ashraf, the chair of the Religious Council of Gush Etzion, arranged for Palestinians in the vicinity of Hebron to visit the bereaved Frankel family. One of the visiting Palestinians is quoted as saying, "Things will only get better when we learn to cope with each other's pain and stop getting angry at each other. Our task is to give strength to the family and also to take a step towards my nation's liberation." Again, this is a Palestinian speaking, hoping for the liberation from his point of view of his nation. We believe that the way to our liberation is through the hearts of Jews. I'm going to repeat that sentence. We believe that the way to our liberation is through the hearts of Jews. Such attempts to understand the heart of the other should remind us that most Palestinian Arabs and most Jews contain overflowing reservoirs of human compassion. The current nightmare has been brought about by the failure of decent citizens and their governments to condemn and to curb the actions of the lunatic fringes of both societies. As I continue to reflect upon the unfolding tragedy in Israel, I hear in my mind's ear the words of the Afro-American poet Langston Hughes, who began his 1951 poem, Harlem, with a series of questions. what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? It seems to me that at least one explanation for the most recent outbreak in hostilities is that for too many years, both Palestinians and Israelis have been living under the heavy weight of dreams deferred. Both peoples live with the still unrealized dream of a life without fear, without hatred, a life of peace, cooperation, and mutual affirmation. And as of yet, neither Palestinian nor Israeli has found a way to transform dream into reality. The price of the dream so long deferred is all too often the eruption of violence. As Hughes warns us with the pointed question which ends his poem, or does it explode? The pain-filled events of the summer provide the tragic answer to Hughes' urgent question. Most observers understand that there can be no long-term military solution to the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. For the problem is essentially a political one, and it requires a political solution. In the short term, Israel, from my perspective, must use its military might to defend itself from Hamas rockets. The issue then is finding a balance between Israel's short-term military requirements and the long-term need for peaceful and prudent political accommodation. Israel's late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin well expressed this conundrum by insisting that the state must fight terror as if there is no peace process, and pursue the peace process as if there is no terror. And I end my column with a question. Are there at this time Israeli and Palestinian leaders who possess the wisdom and the courage to achieve such paradoxical goals?
Martha?
We could go with that question right there. In May, I had the opportunity for my second trip to Israel, West Bank, and this time was able to go to Gaza. I went with other AFSC staff to visit our program work in Israel, Palestine, and West Bank and Gaza. I'd been there 6 years before, and I was really curious to see what had changed. But before I go there, I want to back up and do some more big picture pieces. And we'll have plenty of time to talk about them all later. AFSC in the United States does a lot of its work around the militarization, both in the way it's the only tool we have with our foreign policy, and now we're doing work on the militarization of our police, and have been doing that for some time. So in Israel, a lot of our work is around the militarization of the Israeli economy. And that is done by both young people and some elders who are Israelis. It's not that Americans go over and tell them what to work on. These are Israelis who are challenging the prioritization of military solutions to conflict. We spent some time with some young people who are in the process of trying to figure out whether or not they'll resist conscription, which is required of all Israeli citizens upon graduation from high school. with the exception of Orthodox Jews and Palestinian citizens. The presence of the military in Israeli society, for those who aren't used to it, is, to me, kind of stunning. The soldiers who live at home and who commute by bus, and they have their guns slung over their shoulder as they climb on the bus. Soldiers after work standing around on the street corner. It's a very present and normal part of life in Israel. So that's a piece of the work that we're doing there, and therefore that was partly the lens through which I was seeing things. My visit to the West Bank included visits to East Jerusalem, Ramallah, Belin, Bethlehem, Hebron, and a displaced community of herders in the South Hebron Hills, a kibbutz near Sderot. Sderot is right outside of Gaza and is where many of the homemade rockets land. And I spent a full day in Sderot when I was there before and had fascinating and extensive conversations with people there then. We can talk about that later. And we also visited a Bedouin community. But one of the things that we need to do to have these conversations, I think, is to make efforts to be honest and say some things that sometimes feel hard to say. And when I'm saying these, I'm saying them in that spirit to have a conversation, not to blame, not to put up walls. There are plenty of those to go around already. But one of the things that we have to deal with is the fact that Israel, though it's a very small nation, it's one of the biggest military powers in the world. It depends on who you ask, somewhere between the 11th and 4th largest military in the world, and it has nuclear weapons. It also is vulnerable. It has been from its beginning. It was not welcomed to the neighborhood when it was created. And that history informs and shapes how people experience what's happening now. The younger generation has a different experience of that because they don't remember that. It's stories to them. The elders remember a very different time, and that shapes how they talk about things. Israel has been on the receiving end of rockets, most of them small homemade rockets that can't be guided, that are literally about this big, a metal tube that's just sort of almost flung like a catapult. As an Israeli said to me in Sderot, it's like when you put a message in a bottle. It's them trying to reach out and say, we're still here, does anybody notice? We're in distress, and nobody's listening. This was an Israeli woman telling me this is how she explains it to her son. And they had a rocket land in their backyard that morning. She's telling me this in this calm voice, but she's shaking so hard from that experience that the whole couch was shaking. I was really touched by her commitment to maintaining the humanity of the people in Gaza. She remembered a time when they went back and forth all the time, when they got their car fixed and their hair cut in Gaza, and people from Gaza came and worked in Israel, and they were friends. And she wanted her son to know that, and to know that they were in distress. Paying attention, however, as we have these conversations, to the disproportionate reality of power is something that we just need to flag. Palestine is not officially a nation. It doesn't have a military. The Oslo Accords gave some municipalities the right to self-governance and the right to a local police force. It created a national assembly and an elected chairman for an interim period of 5 years in 1994. And that has continued to kind of be renewed and lose energy as the peace process failed to realize a nation state. And as the freedom of movement within the West Bank was restricted more and more. It's reached a point where Palestinian leaders have to get permission to go from one part of the West Bank to another. And they're often not given that permission. So that makes any kind of national campaign or national leadership very difficult. Now a couple of sort of more personal observations. And this is about the West Bank, not Gaza, although it's true in Gaza just to a greater degree. The occupation is pervasive in everyday life. It controls one's ability to move from one town to another. You have to get a permit to do that. You have to apply for the permit. You have to do that in business hours. You know, there are lots of things that make being a family, that make having a baby and needing to get to the hospital, it makes these things difficult. Checkpoints are scary. And if you're moving from town to town, you have to go through a checkpoint. Because the way the settlements and the roads that are restricted for Israeli access, divide the land. In order to get from one place to another, you have to go through a checkpoint. The soldiers check all the papers and generally there's one or two people doing the paperwork, and there's always one soldier standing with an automatic machine gun, just kind of casually pointing it at people in the space, closed space that you're in to go through the checkpoint. It's incredibly intimidating. Palestinian mothers have to teach their children as soon as they can walk how to deal with that so they don't get hurt. And it's a conversation just like African Americans have to have with their boys about how to behave with a police officer. Palestinians have to have that same conversation. Israel controls the economy. It controls the exports and imports and the currency. It controls broadband availability. There's no 3G in the West Bank or Gaza. All phones, both mobile and landlines, are routed through Israel, which was how they could call people up and say, this is David, Monica, we're coming to bomb your house. Please leave. They had that information because of the way the phone system works. It controls the water and the electricity and the physical infrastructure, and it controls building permits and has severely limited those. So as Palestinian families grow, they have to build to accommodate more. They can't get permits, so they add on to the house or they build a new house, and that house can be demolished at any time because it's not properly permitted. Okay.
This part to it.
Okay. So the other part of my trip was to Gaza, where all of that occupation reality carries, except that Gaza is even more so. Nobody can leave Gaza. Very few people can get into Gaza. We were able to get in because the American Friends Service Committee has been in Gaza since 1948, when it provided the first refugee housing, tents for people who had fled the fighting in 1948 and had come to the Gaza area fully expecting to be able to return when the fighting stopped. We've had program work there ever since. Gaza, its blessing is it has the sea. It's the same, Gaza is the same size as the East Bay. Bristol, Barrington, Warren, and Aquidneck Island. And it's got 1.8 million people in that space. Its sewer system has been bombed in 2008. It's rebuilt most of that. Its electricity is vulnerable on a good day. It was bombed again during the most recent bombing. While you were waiting and listening to family in Israel, I was turning into a Facebook addict because that's how people in Gaza were able to communicate. And I was checking that visceral check every morning, getting up to check and see who was there. It's been a long, long summer.
I just want to.
One more. I'd like to close with, when we talk with Palestinian young people in Gaza and the West Bank, we'd ask them, what do you want us to tell Americans? They would say two things. They'd say, we're just people. We're not terrorists. We just want to live our dreams. And we want people in the world to value Palestinian lives as highly as they value Israeli lives. So that's their message to you.
I'm going to ask us not to applaud because there are people here from different perspectives, and that only adds to an atmosphere that may be less than helpful. So I'm just going to ask if you refrain from doing that. Thank you. I think what we're going to do, I'm just watching time. We want to give you a chance to participate. So I'm going to give Jim, you no more than 5 minutes. I'll give Martha no more than 5 minutes to kind of respond a little bit. And then we'll open it up for some conversation with those of you who've come to listen. Just to let you know, our time frame is probably around 8:15. We'll kind of bring our broad conversation to a close and give our two participants a chance to kind of summarize. So, Jim, I'm gonna keep a little tighter look on the clock for both of you now. So, you guys could both make great Baptist preachers. So, that'd be great. But anyway, I'm a Baptist preacher, so I can make comments like that. But anyway, I'm going to ask Jim, and I'll monitor the time.
I'm still not a Baptist preacher. In a recent conversation, one of my favorite Israeli writers, Amos Oz, also I think known in English as, I think Amos Oz, I think could have, but it's Amos Oz, is a well-known peace activist. And yet, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry. Amos Oz, a well-known Israeli activist. He's well into his 70s at this point. He's not nearly, doesn't look the same as when I first saw him in Providence about 40 years ago. He was commenting why his kind of peace activism is different from European peace activism. And he was commenting on, he had a relative who managed to survive Theresienstadt, or terrorism, which was really not one of the worst camps, although almost everyone who went there wound up dead. And what he said was, this relative said to Amos Oz, it was not the placards and the flowers of the peace activists who saved me in 1945, but the submachine guns of the Russian army. Peace, at least in pre-Messianic times, is intimately connected with power. And for the first time in 2,000 years, the Jewish people in the state of Israel are trying to figure out how to use power. And, you know, they're not perfect at doing that. And certainly, by one calculation, you could say that apparently 30 Gazans have died for every Israeli, if I'm getting that. It's approximately 30 to 1. Now, it's easy to condemn Israel for doing that, and they certainly have made, there is clearly an asymmetry. But the enemy of Israel, and I want to keep it to the discussion to Gaza, there's much that you said about the West Bank, with which I could agree. I was also in the West Bank, and I was also at a demolished home which should never have been demolished, but that's a whole other discussion. So we're talking about Gaza. And Gaza at the moment, in the last few days, has let loose, and this is as of 3 days ago, since the last ceasefire, 30 missiles have been launched from UN facilities, 248 from schools, and 331 from mosques. When you have this, and I understand why Hamas is doing this. To be very cynical, every time an Israeli is killed, that's a plus for Hamas. And for Hamas, every time a Gazan is killed, it's also a plus, because they have to fight. It's an asymmetric warfare. The enemy at the moment is not the 1.8 million Gazans. And it would be obscene to claim that to be the case, from my perspective. The enemy is Hamas. We'll have time for questions and comments.
Yes, we'll take comments later.
So the problem that Israel has at the moment is how to protect its citizens in a proportionate way. I'm not a military expert. Those of you who know me know that I tend to be on the political, somewhat left of center. Okay? But the real issue here is figuring out how Israel can most morally use its disproportionate power to protect its citizens.
Okay, Martha, 5 minutes.
One of the pieces I skipped over was a little bit of history about how things got to where they are in Gaza. After 1967, the Palestinian Authority was in charge of, or Fatah party, the PLO, was in charge of things in Gaza, but it mostly couldn't get there, the leadership, and tensions in the West Bank claimed a lot of their attention, and Gaza sort of felt neglected. In 2005, Israel pulled out the settlements that it had in Gaza. In 2006, things kind of deteriorated politically in the region. In 2006, has anybody here ever cast a protest vote? You didn't like so-and-so, so you voted for someone else? Yeah, that's what happened in Gaza. That's how Hamas was elected. They had been being very efficient at providing medical facilities, helping with education, and providing some military security, or policing security, in an area that was pretty much unpoliced. I think most Gazans will say very carefully that they had no love lost for Hamas, but they needed a government, and that was who they chose. Interesting back piece of history, the US has done this over and over again, and it comes back to bite us. You don't like who you're dealing with, so you support their very small counter group. Well, Israel kind of supported Hamas back in the beginning, and because it splintered folks off from the Palestinian Authority, from Fatah, which was getting too strong. It kept the Palestinian political field divided in a way that was advantageous, and our government has done that over and over again in countries around the world, so we're familiar with that pattern. Hamas then got support from the Muslim Brotherhood and grew in its power. It also claimed some of the responsibility for the rocket fire into Gaza, although most of that was done by even more extreme groups. An important, one last piece of history is that after the 2012 war, conflict, whatever we want to call it, lasted just a couple of weeks. The ceasefire contained a couple of essential ingredients. One of them was that Hamas would stop the rocket fire, even though it didn't actually control the groups, some of the more radical groups. It made a commitment to try to do that. It did that. For the 2 years since 2012, only a few rockets have been launched into Israel. Israel's part was to loosen the siege, which allowed, which severely restricted movement, especially out of Gaza. Students would get accepted at universities abroad, couldn't leave, people couldn't leave to visit family, people couldn't go to the West Bank to see family. It really became like a big prison in some ways. People just couldn't go anywhere. That's what people are reacting to now. And it's not that Hamas that is who they want necessarily as leaders forever, but Hamas has stood up for an insistence that they can't go back to the status quo. They can't go back to living under siege anymore. And that is held by Palestinian civil society throughout Gaza. And there's a very active civil society leadership made up of university professors, business leaders, their version of the Chamber of Commerce. It's a very dynamic, not necessarily, it's not Hamas, it's not Fatah, it's just civil society using its voice. And they've been very clear that they just can't go back.
I'm going to give you an opportunity to ask some questions. I'm going to ask that you do this. I'm going to ask that you raise your hand. Well, wait till you're recognized. I'll try and, I don't really know what anybody's perspective is here, so I'll try to make sure that we're not stacking any sort of a deck. But we'll go back and forth. I saw this gentleman's hand up first. So, sir, if you would just stand up and just be nice and loud so we can all hear.
Thank you very much, Reverend. And I have a question for both Martha, hi, good to see you again, and for Rabbi Rosenberg, good to see you again. And my starting point is really something, Rabbi, that you said, which is that, in your opinion, as you see it, or how you phrased it, there's enough blame to go around, and you are looking forward. And my first comment slash question, Martha, is to you, and that is the following. I, for myself, would absolutely agree with what Rabbi Rosenberg said, that he agreed, or could agree with much of what you said about the militarization and problems in the West Bank. I tried to listen carefully to your comments, and I did not hear any condemnation of Hamas's, or the other extreme groups that you referred to, of their militarization, of their attacks. Again, I raise this in the spirit that I understand Rabbi Rosenberg said it, to look forward, not to look for blame. And Rabbi Rosenberg, my comment or question to you is that I'm aware that in Israel and in the West Bank, there is Israeli-Palestinian cooperation. During this operation of the last month and a half, to calm things down, to have understandings, to speak out for peace, to speak out for the rights of both Palestinians and Israelis. And it seems to me, from an American point of view, this sort of cooperation of that represents is important. I hope that perhaps after Martha comments, you could comment on whatever you're aware of Israeli-Palestinian cooperation that's going on, even as this operation goes on. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm making this up as we go along because we didn't have any formal rules, so I pulled out one of my most obnoxious tools. It's a timer, okay? And what I'm going to do is, where there are folks answering questions, they'll be able to see this. I will start this, so you'll have only 2 minutes to answer the question. If you stop before that, that's fine. I'll reset it for the other person so that we can get as many people to ask questions as possible, okay?
I work for a Quaker organization. We're pacifists. I sometimes forget that I might need to say that condemnation of all violence is part of where I come from. That said, there are a couple of that are not my opinions. I don't think the violence of this does anything to move us any closer towards peace. That's why I want the violence to stop, all of the violence to stop. But we also have to understand that occupation is violence, and that structural violence has to be addressed as well. And I think that it's my understanding that people who are occupied in international law have some right to resistance. I don't think a military response, the violent response to that is the way to go. In the West Bank, there's huge amounts of, and I'd love somebody to ask a question about this, I'm watching the timer, of commitment to nonviolent resistance. It's huge, it's profound. And it's there in Gaza as well. But I think because the situation is more extreme, the response is also more extreme. 7 seconds.
Very good, you beat the timer.
Okay. Again, I think the situation in the West Bank is very different than in Gaza. I will point out that the rockets are coming from Gaza even as we speak. So, and that is really what I would hope we would concentrate on. I'd be happy to come back and talk about the complexities of the West Bank. You asked about cooperation. When some of the Republican senators wanted to stop all aid to the Palestinians, AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, objected strenuously precisely because the Palestinians are cooperating with the Israelis in terms of policing on the West Bank. And that aspect of cooperation is something positive. I would hope that it could be built on in the future.
Okay, I'm going to, no, we're going to keep it this way because there are people out here who really want to ask questions. This lady had raised her hand, and then I saw a gentleman back here. So this lady was before, and then sir, we'll come back to you, okay? All right, ma'am, would you like to ask me a question? Well, we'd like your question to be fairly brief so we can give the response to the folks.
I would first like to comment about the circular that was given out. I've never in my life seen.
Ma'am, we can't hear what you're saying. Folks can't hear what you have to say.
Okay, I'm sorry.
And I would hope that if you have a problem with the circular, I'm going to ask you to talk to the folks who organized this, because we have limited time, and I'd like to keep it focused on what's happening with the situation
Yeah, because
here.
it was based as the history, and it is not. But anyway, I take issue.
Well, let's do that after, okay? Let's not deal with the poster right now.
Give her the microphone.
Oh, give her the microphone. Oh, okay.
You know, you say that you're interested in peace, and you're very pro-Palestinian. I haven't heard one pro-Israeli viewpoint from you, but it's not new. The thing that bothers me is that you somehow feel that you need to demilitarize the mentality of Israelis, but somehow you're willing to overlook the fact that Arab children in both Gaza and in the West Bank are being taught systematically in the school system to hate and be pro-killing Jews. They're called pigs, they're called all kinds of things, and they're encouraged to be shaheeds. Right? Shaheed is supposed to be a martyr by exploding oneself. I don't see how you can somehow put together your very peace-oriented mind with that kind of stuff and not be appalled by it, and not feel that you should take a stand and try and tell these people that is what they got them where they are now. Look, Hamas became powerful
So,
in
ma'am,
Gaza.
can I ask you, what is your question, please?
I'm commenting, and she can answer if she wants.
I'd like to have a question if you could, okay?
The question is why that issue is not addressed.
Okay. If somebody could bring us back the microphone, that'd
Okay,
be great.
another comment.
And we'll let her address it, and then we'll give the rabbi a chance to have a say on this as well. Okay?
I have a couple of comments. One is that I never saw any evidence of children being taught to hate. I can speak just from my experience. My experience is children being taught very actively that they want a peaceful world and that they want to live in peace with their neighbors. I heard young Palestinians talking over and over and over again, I just want to be able to go about my life. There also is a lot of documentation that there actually isn't a lot of hate taught in the schools. And there's a fascinating book by Nurit Khaled Elhanan, who's an Israeli educator.
She is well known. She and her son are well known for doing it.
Let's let this lady.
She and her brother, who has done an analytical study of textbooks in Israel that says that there's actually some teaching in Israel of the same thing that you're accusing Palestinians teaching of. And it's the book is fascinating. You can debate it, you can disagree with it, but it is what it is.
Okay. Jim, would you like to make a statement?
Unfortunately, in these circumstances, on both sides, there's been a rise in racism, and I can only say that I am pleased that there's been an initiative launched by the Education Minister, Shai Peron of Israel, to combat, and I'm reading precisely, the growth of racism and incitement in Israeli society with a special education program in Israeli schools in the new year. So that Israel, I'm not going to speak about what's going on in the Palestinian schools, I don't know. But I do know that there is a problem and that it's being acknowledged by no less than the Minister of Education. The other thing I would want to say, that one of the reasons I say that the enemy is not the Gazans, the 1.8 million, but Hamas, as you know, in Hamas's charter, they're still quoting from the Soviet forgery the Protocols of the Elder of Zion, and one of their objectives is not only do they want Israel eradicated, but they want all Jews dead. It's part of their statement. So it's very hard to do to have peace negotiations with someone who wants you dead.
Okay, the gentleman right here in the brown shirt, your hand was up. Do you need the microphone, or can
No,
you
sir,
stand
I
up
think I can.
and let us
can
hear
be-
your question?
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for giving me this time to ask my question, and thank you both, for all three of you, for being there. I am very uncomfortable with this conversation. It's because I have Jewish friends which I have lost as a result of what's happened in this, just since 2012. Men that I have loved very dearly, and we are no longer friends. I have found that I cannot discuss this with men and women that I have grown up with who are Jews. I cannot discuss this with them. A script immediately starts, all doors shut. There is no reasonableness. There is no room for anything other than, you don't understand. This is, the Palestinians hate all Jews, and they want to kill us all. And the wall immediately comes up, and there's nothing that can happen. And I understand they're very reasonable people that want to discuss it in a greater length, but I am very uncomfortable about this. And I would like both of you to talk about the fact that this is a very discomforting conversation, and how both of you have struggled with it. I'd like you both to talk about that, and you too, Reverend, if you've had that experience. I think that would help us all.
All right, so Rabbi, we'll start with you this time.
Well, I think I tried to indicate in the reason I began by reading a column I wrote, because that column is expressing my conflict. I try to make a big distinction between people who are clearly state they want Israel gone and Jews dead, and when they say it, Jewish history teaches us that if someone says they want us dead, we got to believe them. But at the same time, I have been working with various peace groups, and I have been behind the Green Line, working with Palestinians, and we have invited Palestinians to speak at various programs that we've had. And I'm trying to live with the ambivalence. There are two very different narratives of what people want, two different versions of history. If I could just plug a book, I didn't write it. I think Ari Shavit's book well expresses the complexity of Israel and what's going on in the Middle East. There are no easy answers to this. This problem is not going to be solved in my lifetime, and unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be solved in my children's lifetime. Maybe it'll be solved in the lifetime of my 5 grandchildren. So it's a struggle. It's an ambiguous situation, and I wish I had more answers. All I can do is struggle.
I'll do it after you respond.
So, like many of you, I grew up in the 50s and 60s, where Israel was a new state. I was in Vermont. And through my church, I think, I fell in love with the idea of Israel. And while there weren't many Jewish people in my community, one of the 5 kids in the whole school system was my age, and we were friends. And through her, I developed a deep, and through religious education, developed a real deep appreciation of Jewish history and values. Somewhere in the late 70s, before the first Intifada, something made me begin trying to understand what had happened to the Palestinians. And that has taken me on a long journey. And yes, it's really hard to talk about. But I think it's changing a little bit. When I first came back for my first trip 6 years ago, there were a lot of things that I said out loud tonight that I couldn't say out loud 6 years ago. There's a little bit more room for conversation. And that's why I was willing to engage in a program like this. There are conversations we need to have. There are competing narratives, but there's also common ground and common humanity. There are two groups, one called the Parents Circles and one called Combatants for Peace, that are people meeting through their pain to bridge some of these gaps. We're having conversations here. I hope we can engage in these hard conversations.
I'm going to press the button for me, so you can all know that I'm putting myself under the same requirements as everybody else. I'll tell you two quick stories. Many of you may or may not know that the Council of Churches is made up primarily of mainline Protestant denominations. One of those denominations is the Presbyterian denomination, and they probably, of the mainline Protestant denominations, have been one of the more aggressive denominations in talking about this particular issue. Several years ago, there was a proposal that was going to be brought to their summer synod and to their national body, and across the country, people like myself were asked if we could facilitate a conversation between some local folks in the Jewish community and the folks who were going to this Presbyterian meeting. And so we were able to call together a meeting with Marty Cooper, who some of you know from the Jewish Alliance, and two rabbis. And then we had three Presbyterians, one who was going to be the actual delegate from this synod, one who was the alternate, and one other. Now, I'll just share with you quickly. The one who was the alternate thought Israel could do no wrong. The one who was actually going was very much in the middle of the road, and the one who wasn't going felt that the Palestinians couldn't do anything wrong. I want to share that with you because within the world I live in, this same range of opinion exists, and the conversation goes on all the time. At the last situation with Gaza, there was a letter of protest written by a number of mainline Protestant leaders, including the National Council of Churches. That letter was sent to Congress. The National Council of Churches had been facilitating a conversation with the Jewish community for several years, but sent that letter without informing their discussion partners what they were doing. Those discussions broke down over 2 years ago. In November, I'll be in Washington and be part of the restart of those conversations. I think we all need to be very thoughtful about how we can have these, and they are, incredibly difficult conversations because people's lives are at stake here. And my guess is that probably most of us in this room know and love people who live in that area. And that takes it beyond the academic. That means that we're talking about people we care about, and that becomes more difficult. I'm trying to remember, there's several of you had your name up, hands up all at once, but there was a lady in the back whose hand is not up now. Did you want to ask a question? Because after you, I don't remember what the order was, but I do remember seeing your hand.
So I spent 2 weeks as well in Israel and the West Bank in May and came back just in early June before the most recent crisis. And I want to make one comment.
Louder.
I spent 2 weeks in the West Bank and in Israel meeting with women, mothers, peace activists, Israeli and Palestinian, across the West Bank and in Israel. So one comment I will make is that until you go there, we all have many ideas about what the conflict looks like from here. But until you go there, it's very, very hard to understand what it looks like on the ground in terms of the way Israelis experience it and the way the Palestinians experience it. What I came away with is that, and I'm a lawyer by training, I do human rights work and health work, is that when you look at the way that the occupation plays itself out on a daily basis, people live in situations that none of us could imagine. in terms of the violations of human rights on a daily basis for Palestinians. Now, the way that that gets framed in Israel and it gets framed here is that that's necessary, right, to protect Israel's security. But as someone who has always studied root causes of problems and trying to understand how you get to the root cause without violence, you have to understand that the occupation is the root cause.
So
And
can
that
I ask
people's-
you, can I ask you for your
Yes.
question, please?
So my question is, and this is to the rabbi, who I think raised probably what is the most important question, which is, Israel clearly does have the power here. How does Israel use that power for peace? And I think the question on the ground there is, if the occupation is the problem, how can Israel figure out how to address the occupation to get at the root causes of the violence?
I have been very disappointed that Benjamin Netanyahu has not called me up.
Don't hold your breath.
So,
I'm worried if he does.
coming at it, well, he speaks English well. I mean, he was born in this country, but in all seriousness, from my, I have been told many times by Israelis, appropriately, I don't live in Israel, I don't vote in Israel, the rockets are not falling on my head, although they were falling on the heads of family members. I think what needs to happen is to have a government that's more sympathetic to getting back to the peace process. But most Israeli citizens don't seem to feel that way at the moment. It's sad for me, but you know, I have an opportunity. If I wanted to change things, and I think I'm getting a little old for that, I just turned 70. I mean, the only legitimate way I can do that is to go claim Israeli citizenship and get involved in the political process there. The Israeli politics, as you know, is extremely complicated, and you know, I think it's a right-wing government, it's a right-wing coalition, and as far as I can tell, their calculation is that the status quo at the moment is better than anything else. I don't see it that way, but I don't vote there, and that's the way it is. It's frustrating.
Martha, would you like to say something to that?
I agree with you that working on the root causes is where the solution is, and that's where the really hard conversations are. It's about figuring out who can live where, and addressing on some level the yearning of many people to return to where they, not to their exact house, but to where they once lived. In some places that's more simple than others, in others it's very complicated. And the reality is many people, as the generations move on, that dream will become different. Because they've grown up in some other place. Their physical sort of imprint is another place. The other piece that is just the occupation, and I know we were trying to stay on Gaza, but Gaza is part of Palestine, and its politics are tied up in the West Bank, and we really can't divorce it entirely from that. The realities of occupation unfortunately leave scars. One of the things that AFSC has done a lot of work on is trauma healing. We had, in Israel, we had a lot of people who were traumatized. Now we have a lot of Palestinians who have been traumatized. We've got to do some deep healing to shift those dynamics so that we don't keep repeating them.
Okay. I guess this is going to be, this is one of those things where my peripheral vision may not be as good as others, but I think the first name I just saw go up is this lady right in front of me. Yes, ma'am. Would you just be really loud, and would you get right to your question for us? Because our time is kind of moving along.
I want to say that we have had a broad and terrific discussion about a lot of the underlying issues and some very important things, but we did come here to talk about the current crisis in Israel-Gaza, and that's where I'm focused. True disclosure, I have a lot of family in Israel. My daughter is a journalist there, and I'm deeply enmeshed in it. My immediate concern is the crisis right now, and the here and the now. We have thousands and thousands of people hurting on both sides, more psychological damage in Israel right now, fortunately, because of the protection of the Iron Dome, but people going through great psychological trauma, people dying and bleeding on the other side, and people delighted every time there's a ceasefire, and breathing happily and rushing out, and in Gaza going to the market, buying their bread, buying their supplies, and hoping it will hold, and people in Israel being able to not run to bomb shelters every other minute and going on, and then boom, it's back again. My question goes back, I know there are no answers. Rabbi Rosenberg alluded to the importance of just having some good, strong leaders, but we don't. And my question goes to the heart of where we are right now. How do we get to the point of discussing the bigger issues, stop this immediate crisis of violence, and deal with these bigger issues? What happens now?
Okay, Martha, I'll let you start, and then we'll have Jim speak.
I hesitate to speak for anyone, but the best of my understanding is that Gazan civil society, not Hamas, is saying we have to have some relief. We can't go back to total siege. That's, to just get a ceasefire takes them back to that total siege. And there's they call it slow death versus fast death. And people were dying because of the siege, as well as inconvenienced by the siege. I think there's a holding out for some inkling from Israel that they will get something of that. I think they're more than willing to hold the fire if they get some of that for you. How you get there, what kind of leadership that takes, I don't know. And who moves first, I don't know.
I need more than 2 minutes to solve the whole problem. But not having that, a big issue is trust. And a big issue between liberal Zionists like myself and conservative Zionists is that we liberal Zionists have a more optimistic view of human behavior. But this is I'll give you an example. I'll ask just 2 questions. Who could have thought in 1944 that 2 of the most reliable allies of the United States would be Germany and Japan? Who could have believed in 1944 that one of the most reliable allies of Israel would be Germany? On the other hand, as someone of a more conservative bent said to me, well, one of the reasons Japan is your ally is a little something called an atom bomb. And, you could look, there's no correct way to read history. I think the tunnels showed that the cement that was being sent in was not being used to construct schools. On the other hand, without hope, we have nothing.
Time for one more question, and I knew your hand was going to go up first, so go ahead. You'll ask your question and get right to it, okay?
Okay, what I'd like to do is call attention to a TV program which runs every Friday on public access. It's called The Struggle. It's produced by a Jewish friend of mine in Connecticut, but it's very sympathetic to the Palestinian struggle too. Anyway, if you have either Cox Channel 13 or Verizon Channel 32, please tune in on Friday at 8:30 or Saturday at 9:30. It's going to be about Gaza this week.
Okay, did you have a question, or
No, no
just a
question.
commercial?
Just a
All right, we have room for one more question. Time for one more question. Yes, sir, in the brown hat.
This hat?
Yeah. I think, well, brown, green, whatever color it is. I'm getting old, so.
I want to offer two quotes, and I do have a question,
Okay.
very quick. The first one is from the poet Alta, who said, "Let's stop fighting, you go first." And that's a quote that really helps me in my times when I'm most upset about what's happening, although we're here talking about this. Thousands of people are dying every day in conflicts around the world. Their skin might be a different color, but thousands of people are dying, but we're focused on this issue right now. And the other quote is from Howard Zinn, who said, "There's no flag large enough to cover the shame of killing innocent people, whether they're Palestinians or
Would you
Israelis."
repeat that, please?
There's no flag large enough to cover the innocence, cover the killing of innocent people. But the question I have is, what would happen, since this journalist was beheaded by IS, suddenly, there's action being taken, people are really enraged. I mean, this kind of thing happens all the time, but the American people, I think, and people around the world, a single issue sometimes can pull people together in a way that's different from our real short memories. What would happen if, because of the Iron Dome, and quite frankly, I would be living in enormous fear, as is my cousin's daughter, who's an Israeli soldier, who he's been in touch with. So I mean, I would be in enormous fear just in case one of the Iron Dome wasn't successful. But what would happen if Israel made a decision to not retaliate? This is a hypothetical. I'm not suggesting they do that. But I'm just saying, in terms of world opinion, what do you both think would happen if Israel said, we've read this Howard Zinn quote, and we've made a decision that the killing of it, there's no flag large enough, including the Israeli flag, for the death of innocent people. What would happen around the world in terms of pressure being put on Hamas, or at least allowing the people that you're talking about, Martha, who are in Gaza, who voted for spurious reasons, to maybe take a little bit more action? What do you both think would happen if Israel said, we're not going to retaliate? We read this thing about, let's stop fighting, you go first. And we decided to not. What would happen?
Okay, Jim's going to go first, and then Martha.
I'm going to quote from the Bible.
That's a good book.
Not bad. It's a collection. It's a library. It's from the prophet Amos. Lo Navi Anothi Velo Ben Navi Anothi. I'm not a prophet, nor the son of a prophet.
Martha?
Top that.
I don't know, that was me. I'm fascinated by the question. It's the kind of courageous thinking that needs to take place. Somebody needs to be bold enough to say, we just lost 3 young men. That was horrible. And instead of rampaging through the West Bank and arresting 800 people and killing 12 people and doing a huge show of force, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to understand the situation. What do we need to learn? What do we need to do to fix this, to heal this? The whole concept of restorative justice is to figure out what's broken and what needs to be fixed, what needs to be done to make it hurt less. That's kind of the conversation. That's what diplomacy is supposed to be about. But we put all of our resources and energy into the military solutions and underfund our State Department, not that that's the answer either. But we underfund and under-resource and underthink other ways of doing things.
Okay, we're at a point where we need to, we want to start to bring things to a close, and I'm going to ask both Martha and Jim to take 2 minutes to just kind of summarize whatever last points they want to make, and I'd like to make a brief statement when we finish. So we'll, again, keep these to 2 minutes. Jim went first, so we'll let him go second this time. So Martha, you'll get to go first.
There have been a couple of questions about Hamas, and I am not an expert on Hamas, but I want to say that for better or for worse, they became the government. Whether they split off into a sort of a group that was government and a group that was militarized. We saw that in Northern Ireland. We've seen that in other places. They're making an effort to be a government. And recently they wanted to reconcile with the Palestinian Authority, with Fatah, to become a national group. And in so doing, they're tacitly acknowledging, whether it's on paper or not, they're tacitly acknowledging Israel's right to exist because the PLO has done that and works with Israel. So it's a kind of, we have to take the good motion and try to give it a chance to grow, not say, oh, now we can't talk to any of these people because they're talking to each other. Anyway, that's a very practical piece. I take my hope from the young people, both in Israel, where I met some amazingly thoughtful young people who love their country, are very troubled by what it means for Israel's soul to be an occupier, and want to end that and find some way to do that works for both people. And I find over and over again found Palestinian youth who just want to live and to let live and to find a way to do that.
I'm going to conclude by reading a poem, a translation of a poem by Yehuda Amichai, one of Israel's great contemporary poets who died in the year 2000. There's one term in the translation that it talks about the Chad Gadya machine. If you're not familiar with that, it has to do with something that's sung on at the Seder, the annual Seder. And it's kind of, this is the house that Jack built, except the angel of death slaughters the slaughterer who kills the ox, who kills the dog that bites the cat. It goes like that. It's just terrible, but it's a folk song. So that's what it's alluding to. It's just you don't want to get caught up in that machine. You're going to wind up crushed. This is called in Hebrew, Roeh Aravi Mechapes Gedi Behar Tzion. An Arab shepherd is searching for his goat on Mount Zion. An Arab shepherd is searching for his goat on Mount Zion. And on the opposite mountain, I am searching for my little boy. An Arab shepherd and a Jewish father, both in their temporary failure. Our voices meet above the Sultan's pool in the valley between us. Neither of us wants the child or the goat to get caught in the wheels of the terrible Chad Gadya machine. Afterwards, we found them among the bushes, and our voices came back inside us, laughing and crying. Searching for a goat or a son has always been the beginning of a new religion in these mountains.
Thank you, both Martha and Jim. As I said earlier, This is not just an academic conversation. For many of us, because the world is the size that it is, we know and love people who live in this area, and it makes it a very difficult conversation. I think that we need to obviously keep going. Nobody can beat Amos's quote, and I wouldn't try to do that. But I would say something to all of us. We're citizens of the United States of America. And when America makes up its mind to want to try to be helpful, it can be.
Amen.
And perhaps we need to be in more conversation with some of our leaders and probing them to not just look at where money comes from, but to look where real answers are for people. And to really ask our leaders to do that. And I think, to be very honest with you, and I'm a bit biased because I work with some of these folks a little bit, but I think that the folks who represent us have some degree of openness if we will approach them that way. That's my opinion, that's what I've found with them anyway. I will finish with a biblical quote as well, from my guy. Blessed are the peacemakers. Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you for hosting.